Leading a startup team, whether you're delivering a sugar rush, stocking coffee, or getting a regular delivery of snacks, Office Depot has solutions that fit every startup culture, from getting those first business cards and stationery to ordering fleece pullovers with your new logo. To learn how Office Depot and the California Technology Council have partnered to bring you savings on all of these startup essentials and more, go to californiatechnology.org/member benefits. I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. The high cost of developing therapies impedes the pharmaceutical industry's ability to bring innovative products to market, but also leaves potentially valuable discoveries languishing on university shelves. The Swiss nonprofit foundation Molecule is trying to alter the landscape by establishing an online marketplace to create shared ownership of intellectual property and provide a new funding mechanism for early-stage experimental therapies that could also lead to distributed research and development of promising drugs. We spoke to Paul Kohlhaas, founder of Molecule, about the market it's developing, how it would work, and the challenges it will need to overcome to make it a reality. Paul, thanks for joining us.
Danny, it's great to be on the show. Thank you so much for having me.
We're going to talk about Molecule, its unique approach for funding drug development, and the problem it's trying to address. Let's start with the problems. What are the challenges of drug development that's faced today, and what do you think Molecule can address in its approach?
Yeah, absolutely. So as we kind of all know, I think that the drug development industry as a whole is hitting a what some academics call an innovation crisis, as the internal rate of return within large pharma companies is really kind of hitting a break-even point. That's expected to happen in about 2020. So in about 2020, and these are like studies from Deloitte, BCG, across the industry as a whole, pharma, economically speaking, would be better off cutting R&D, just because drug development is increasingly getting too expensive and there's not enough innovation coming out of the pipeline. I mean, we kind of all know the big numbers that the industry runs on. It can cost up to $2.5 billion on average to bring a drug to market. It's very, very slow, so 10 to 15 years until a drug is approved. And then on top of that, we're hitting this innovation wall. And like some people say, there's an innovation crisis across pharma, and that like the business model of drug development today can be fundamentally questioned. And I think on top of that, especially what's happening in the U.S., there's an increasing loss of trust in the business model that like parts of pharma have pursued for the past, let's say for the past 20 years. If you look at public health crises like the opioid crisis, or just the increasing prices of drugs that are coming onto the market. There was a new gene therapy treatment that was launched at a market price of just over $2 million for a treatment. So the problem that we're really trying to tackle is the incentives, the innovation incentives within the pharmaceutical ecosystem, going from academia through to biotech and then up to large pharma companies, and trying to rethink how incentives for innovation work at that very level.
What incentives does the drug industry have today to create innovation, and what are the value drivers for innovation today?
Yeah, absolutely. So the value drivers for innovation in the pharma space are really based on intellectual property and the patent system. And it's quite interesting to think about innovation in the patent system itself. The intellectual property law and patent law hasn't really changed almost over the past 200 years since the first patents were issued in the United States. So there's been very little legal innovation. And if you think about what a patent essentially does, a patent is a pricing monopoly. But because one company owns a patent, that fundamentally disincentivizes collaboration for anyone else to come in and kind of join in developing a drug. So kind of collaboration across the pharmaceutical space. And so what patents essentially do, they put the onus of drug development, sort of the entire burden of the cost, as well as the risk on one player that then fully owns the commercialization rights to that drug. Now that makes sense, but if we think about how science fundamentally works, science works through collaboration, through data sharing, and to think that our entire development and innovation process is based on just one company doing all the work, no wonder that the drug development is that expensive. And so our first starting point of looking at this problem is looking at how the patent system and intellectual property work. And you might remember, I think about 4 months ago, there was a big hearing in front of the U.S. Senate where major representatives from pharma companies, including Pfizer and Sanofi, and many others, were called in front of the U.S. Senate to testify on the high drug pricing that resulted from these intellectual property monopolies. So our fundamental approach to the problem is like, what if we created a system that allowed fractionalized ownership of intellectual property? Because we believe that's a fundamental disincentive to sharing and collaboratively developing drugs in an approach that is more similar to open source software. So we think that pharma and pharmaceutical development in a lot of ways could work a lot more like modern open source software development works. Of course, there's a lot of caveat to that basic notion, but the fundamental way to make that happen is to look at how intellectual property really works.
Well, let's talk about that. You have likened the drug industry to where the software industry was 30 years ago. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we think how software was developed by companies like Microsoft or IBM in the early 90s or like mid 80s, it was a very, very similar approach. So open source software was developed very proprietary. Everything happened under NDAs. There's these very close-knit research teams that were then developing proprietary software that was being shipped on the machines, where the consumer would pay a very high price. There was very little in-licensing being done. And then what happened as Microsoft was gaining a lot of market shares in the mid and late 90s, the Linux Foundation was kind of launched as a counter movement to that. And then Linux and Red Hat really started promoting new business models around open source software that actually caused large parts of the industry to collaborate on development of software. And I think maybe one last point is that if you think of the marginal price of producing a pill that is already in the market, the marginal price of a pill essentially or a treatment is very, very low. And in the same way, the marginal price of producing another piece of software once you've done all the R&D is also close to zero. So there are, while there's a lot of differences, there's also a lot of similarities in the way that open source software is developed to how pharmaceuticals could be developed.
Well, how did that change software development?
So the way that it changed software development was really it broke up the entire market landscape. And allowed a lot more grassroots development in terms of how the biggest software projects in the world now kind of have come to be commercialized. And has allowed an entire new kind of set of business models to emerge. So if we think of, for example, the Android operating system that is now being run, I think, on over I'd say over 80% of the world's cellular devices. Creating operating system like this allowed an entire new generation of applications to evolve, and that's just been in the course of less than 10 years. And we think that pharma is kind of still operating on those proprietary kind of patent-based business models, and software was in a very similar space in the 90s, but pharma is really still operating in a similar space. And there's a lot of innovation potential for bringing new business models into an industry that really needs it.
What is Molecule and how does it work?
Absolutely. Okay, so maybe just to close one loop, one of the reasons why we can't develop drugs out in the open like we would with software is because of the high development costs that go into developing a drug, and those development costs ultimately need to go back to someone who funded the development of a drug. So open source licenses in the way that we had them in software don't really work in drug development. But what if instead of open sourcing a license, we open sourced essentially the ownership of a patent, of the underlying IP to develop a certain new molecule, to develop a new drug? So what Molecule essentially does, it combines these two big principles. One is like distributing ownership of an asset, like a patent, and then developing that asset in an open source fashion. So what Molecule does is we create essentially open markets for pharmaceuticals. So the Molecule protocol that we're building is essentially a two-sided marketplace. And you have to think of two-sided marketplaces in the same way that you think of essentially Uber is a two-sided marketplace that connects drivers and customers that are looking for a ride, Airbnb. So we've seen these marketplace approaches become extremely effective in a lot of different industries around the world. And pharma is one of the last industries that hasn't really been affected by them yet, but is one that really, I think, is in dire need of it. And so what we do is we have someone who creates IP, so a drug developer. This could be in very early stages coming out of academia, someone who's about to start a spin-off from a university. It could be a biotech or a small pharma company that is already up and running. So someone who is actively developing a new drug, could be an orphan disease. We're looking at a lot of different therapeutic areas. And so that person is essentially looking for funding, but might also want to decrease the development costs and develop that drug in a more transparent and open way, where they could include multiple stakeholders, like patients in a very early stage of development. So what we do is, so that the drug developer would create a market on Molecule, and that market now allows anyone to invest as well as contribute to that compound. And what happens when you get a market, essentially, you sell shares in the ownership of that intellectual property or in the new drug that is being developed. And in return, you would receive funding for the development. So the mechanics that are at work here are kind of similar to making a listing on a stock exchange. In this case, you're not listing your company, though. You would actually be listing the intellectual property of your drug. And the other element, what happens here is it's not just that if you invest in a company, there's normally not that much that you can contribute to that company's development. But in this case, you would actually become a co-owner, or you would become a licensee in that specific drug. And that now means that you could, if you're a researcher, for example, you could actively start researching that compound and producing data about it. So let's say the University of Zurich lists a new potential molecule as a cancer therapeutic, and a researcher in India at the University of Bangalore, he sees this new molecule. He's been looking at a very similar class of molecules and decides he would like to, or she would like to research that drug, purchases a certain number of shares, and then essentially would perform a 3-month study to prove that this drug could affect certain receptors in a certain area, publishes that data, and then the market would correspond depending on if that data is positive or negative. So that's essentially where the whole open source approach comes in. That opens up how the patent system works today, in that today the singular ownership disincentivizes research and collaboration. And by breaking up that ownership model, we can incentivize open source collaboration.
One of the essentials of a marketplace to have a level playing field is that everyone is operating with the same world of information. How does Molecule do that?
Absolutely, great question. So essentially, one way that Molecule drives information out into the open is through creating new incentives around it. And with a marketplace, while everyone may have the same information that is publicly available, we can now essentially use science to create new information that previously wasn't available. And it's very interesting from our perspective what this does to the whole element of like public disclosure of information. Because you can now ask yourself as a scientist, if I produce new data about a potential new molecule, to what extent, and I then have an incentive to contribute that to a public, kind of to a public repository of information. So what we essentially envision what could happen around drug development is that instead of information being closed off and siloed within companies, that researchers and scientists around the world, as well as companies, start contributing their data and their findings into these open source repositories. And again, that's essentially a development that has happened and that we've seen a lot happening in open source software development. That you have these code repositories of different applications that are being worked on by developers from all over the world, sometimes ranging up to 200 to 300 to 400 open source developers that are continuously building out a code base in an entirely open source fashion. So I think in terms of what this does to public disclosure about having equal information into a marketplace, I think it really increases the variety and the diversity of information that's available. And then it also increases the scrutiny around that information.
How does money raised through Molecule actually fund development? If I'm a university that has idle IP sitting on the shelf and I go out and list it on Molecule, am I just raising funds to essentially sell a stake in the IP, or am I actually using that money to develop it?
Great question. So there's two ways that this can go, and we envision a multitude of use cases to emerge on top of the protocol. In one stage, you could say, in one use case, you could say you're essentially a university that wants to offload a piece of like shelf IP and see if there's interest, like if there's purchasing interest in the market. In this case, you don't have anything to fund, and you wouldn't set a specific funding goal. You're essentially just looking to essentially offload that IP. In a different use case, you might actually be actively developing this and might want to fund doing wet lab assays in preclinical development. You might even want to fund like the early stages of a clinical trial. And then you would set a specific funding target. And that funding target could be reached like as more and more interest and more kind of trading happens in that specific market that you've created. So on the one side, you would say, I am willing to sell, for example, 40% of ownership in this IP. And what you're essentially selling at this point, and this already happens in many financial transactions that we see more in the advanced stages of the drug development process in terms of selling future royalty rights. So there's a large private equity firm called Royalty Pharma that has been really very actively driving this business model much more in the advanced and already approved stages in drug development. But the sale of royalty rights, even for pre-approved drugs, is something that happens fairly often. So what you'd be selling at this point is you're selling future royalty rights, and in return, you're getting some level of funding. And within the market parameters, you would specifically define, in addition to the pure amount that I'm selling, I also want to fund, let's say, $1 million for my preclinical studies. So that's very much a possibility.
Is there liquidity in the Molecule market, and how do you assure that? Absolutely. So it's essentially the liquidity question is kind of creating a market from both sides. We're like for our go-to-market, we're planning to engage a lot of different interesting disease areas, and each of those disease areas typically bring their own range of funders with them. So a similar solution like Molecule hasn't really existed before, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see like the early days of a market like this come together. The kind of user bases that we're trying to attract early on are ranging from small-scale institutional investors to biotech traders, to patients themselves who would like to crowdfund
a specific new drug that might affect them. For example, in the orphan disease area, we're making a lot of progress in neglected diseases, specifically in malaria, where there's a large open source community of researchers working on these issues globally already. So we actually see a large amount of potential of not offering, essentially offering a new model of funding, like crowdfunding and crowd investing in specifically in the early stages in underfunded drugs, but not in a way that would constitute as a donation, but that would constitute as something that can actually provide ROI to other users.
Well, what would determine the spread between the buy and the sell, and who would capture that spread?
So in the early stages, I think what constitutes success of a market, if that's maybe what you mean with the spread between a buy and a sell.
I mean, theoretically, you have a two-sided market at any time. Is that correct? Any given moment, I assume there's a bid and an ask, and there's a spread between those two prices. Who captures that spread, and who maintains a market?
Absolutely. So the way that we bootstrap and we run markets on molecule is using a novel pricing and market making mechanism that runs via a smart contract on a blockchain. While this all sounds very complicated, the underlying principle is actually fairly simple. In any traditional market offering, you would normally have an underwriter that ensures that the offering is fully filled. So if, let's say, if I'm offering shares of my company at a certain range, then I need to make sure that all of those shares are sold. And then after that, those shares begin trading on an exchange where you then would have a buy and like a buy side and a sell side. We kind of jump over that step by doing a primary offering, and that primary offering happens directly through a smart contract. So instead of having an underwriter, the underwriting is being done by an autonomous program that prices the shares that are being sold using an algorithm. And what you kind of have to imagine this look like, it's essentially like a price, like a microeconomic price curve that pegs price to supply, and then sells shares to whoever wants to buy them or sell them according to that pricing algorithm. What this really allows us to do is to peg the initial valuation of an offering, and if there is no interest in that, let's say you put on a specific new therapeutic, and this was some on-the-shelf IP, and there was never anyone interested in the IP, you essentially are not taking any risk by conducting that offering, because the risk is essentially being decentralized through that smart contract. So even if there's only very, very little investor interest, you can very easily unwind that offering again, without ever having to do a full-on underwriting as you would if you listed on let's say a NASDAQ or any other exchange.
You mentioned drugs for rare and neglected diseases. Are there certain types of assets you think would be better suited for this market?
Yeah, absolutely. So the assets that we're targeting at the moment, sort of for our go-to-market, are specifically in the translational disease area. So anything that is left the discovery stage that is entering preclinical. And those are typically the stages where we see the biggest amount of potential in terms of these new funding solutions. Because there's a typical problem that drugs in that stage enter into, which is called the valley of death, which means they're not attractive yet to large pharma or for pharma VC venture funding. And they're also not attractive anymore for for grant funding from academia or government. So that's specifically is a stage where we're quite interested in, because also the market valuations or the IP valuations that you typically look at there are range between like 5 to 10 to 15 million, which is quite suitable for a crowdfunding like approach. Other areas that we're looking at specifically into are drugs that are stuck in phase 1 or phase 2 development, that might have just missed their last funding target, and yeah, there's a lot of really, really interesting drugs that unfortunately don't make it through further development stages, either because the commercial viability isn't interesting anymore to a large pharma company, or they're not interesting to VC anymore, And that's specifically something where in the neglected disease area where we're making a lot of, we're getting a lot of great responses. There's one example where an anti-malarial was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to go up to the second stage of clinical trials. And that company then essentially has been, and now they're at an advanced clinical trial stage, and the results have been very positive. But because of the market they're in, they're not really attractive to pharma companies, and they're also not attractive to VC funding anymore. And so that's a use case that we're looking at the moment.
And how would commercialization be handled? Would assets have to be acquired by a traditional pharmaceutical company or other entity to actually commercialize a molecule? Is there an exit from the market?
Yeah, great question. So, as you just pointed out, one common exit that we might see from these markets is an acquisition by a larger pharmaceutical player, and so a system like this is actually highly attractive for players like this, because you have to imagine if drugs in very early development stages come onto an open system like this, and you can essentially see like the daily or the weekly winners and like losers based on new data that is being submitted. So think of a drug essentially being on the system and gaining in market share as more and more attention of the crowd is being paid to it, and more data about it is being submitted. So suddenly you could have a compound, for example, that goes from a market value when it was listed from 5 million to suddenly 500 million, because it's proven as a very interesting candidate. And at this point, a larger pharma player could come in and essentially make a buyout offer to all of the existing holders. What would happen in this case is very similar to how this happens on public markets today. You would hold trading in that specific market, and then all existing holders in that market would receive kind of the buyout from the larger player, and then that larger player could continue to develop that drug.
But if that happens, are you not recreating the fundamental problem you were trying to address with IP?
That's a very good point. So I think what you've already done at this point, you've probably massively decreased ideally you've massively decreased the development costs that have gone up unto that point. But you're absolutely right that this might not be that much different than what the current system is like. Essentially, what we're building as well is like it's a free market. So if the owners in that market, and this then actually goes into governance around how you would govern decision making in a market like this. If the owners of that market essentially are happy with like a larger player coming in and ensuring that the drug actually makes it to market, they could still kind of implement certain pricing rules at that takeover stage. So they could say, for example, if this drug makes it to market, it should ever only be commercialized at that rate. That's one kind of defining factor that can come in at this point. I think in the longer run, and this is more like how the future of pharmaceuticals would work, and again, this is taking some lessons from open source software. I think in the longer runs, what you could essentially see happen is if there's enough market force at that point where a drug is actually looks quite promising, what you could start seeing is like the development of cooperatives, like digital cooperatives around these drugs, where now essentially you have like a public shareholdership that is trying very hard to take this to market and to ensure that the drug isn't actually, let's say, exploited by a larger pharma player when it actually comes to market. I think the biggest questions in this case are the high coordination requirements that come on in the advanced stages of clinical trial. I think kind of a public cooperative or maybe even a foundation owning a drug like this could take it to phase 1. I think the coordination requirements in phase 2 and phase 3 will become quite difficult. But that's not to say that the future couldn't develop that. I think what we could really see through, almost like if you think of these shareholders as they're all in the same boat and they're trying to coordinate a drug coming to market, many of them might be patients, they might be researchers that are actually really invested and interested in bringing this drug to market and pricing it fairly. I think we could really see a fundamental redefinition of what the incentives then are to ultimately bring that drug to market, and not necessarily to pay, let's say, to pay 60 years of corporate debt and shareholder debt to a large pharma company that maintains, let's say, that has over 30,000 employees and offices around the world, but really making drug development much leaner and kind of more community and open source driven.
What's the status of the market? How have you rolled it out in any form yet? And what are the kind of financial regulatory issues you face in putting this into place?
Yeah, absolutely. So our market is still pre-launch. So we've spent the last year really developing the technology to create these new market structures. We're aiming to launch in Q1 next year with a variety of compounds and like early stage IP. We're talking to a lot of universities across the globe, both in the US, in South Africa, in Switzerland. Talking to foundations, we're talking to large pharma as well, like how this might affect their business model. And then obviously talking to a lot of smaller biotech and pharma companies, and really trying to focus on the key, as I said earlier, the key disease areas that we want to launch with. And then kind of bootstrapping the market from both sides. What the product currently looks like from a visualization perspective is a mix between kind of imagine like a Bloomberg-like trading interface mixed with a chemical database, and then strong elements of like a GitHub for scientific developers. So you could actually see who has submitted a certain project, what are the organizations behind that, what are their funding goals, how has this market behaved, what is the ownership structure in this market like, and essentially then what are the chances of success. So we want to bring strong social and data sharing elements into the entire drug development process.
Paul Kohlhaas, founder of Molecule. Paul, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for your time, Danny.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send an email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.